Good evening. Welcome to Three Men in a Boat, Chapter 10. Our first night under canvas, an appeal for help, contrariness of tea kettles and how to overcome, supper, how to feel virtuous, wanted, a comfortably appointed, well-drained desert island, neighbourhood of South Pacific preferred, funny thing that happened to George's father, a restless night. Harris and I began to think that Bell Weir Lock must have been done away with after the same manner. George had towed us up to Staines, and we'd taken the boat from there, and it seemed that we were dragging 50 tons after us and were walking 40 miles. It was 7:30 when we were through, and we got in and sculled up close to the bank, looking for a spot to haul up in. We'd originally tended to go on to Magna Carta Island, a sweetly pretty part of the river where it winds through a soft green valley, and to camp in one of the many picturesque inlets to be found around that tiny shore. But somehow we did not feel we yearned for the picturesque nearly so much as we had earlier in the day. A bit of water between a coal barge and a gasworks would have quite satisfied us for that night. We did not want scenery. We wanted to have our supper and go to bed. However, we did pull up at the point, Picnic Point, it's called, and dropped into a very pleasant nook under a great elm tree, to the spreading roots to which we fastened the boat. Then we thought we were going to have supper. We'd dispense with tea so as to save time. But George said no, and that we'd better get the canvas up first before it got quite dark, whilst we could still see what we were doing. And then, he said, all of our work was done, we could sit down and eat with an easy mind. That canvas wanted more putting up, I think, than any of us had bargained for. It looked so simple in the abstract. You took 5 iron arches, like gigantic croquet hoops, fitted them up over the boat, and stretched the canvas over them and fastened it down. It would take quite 10 minutes, we thought. That was an underestimate. We took the hoops and began to drop them into sockets placed for them. You would not imagine this to be dangerous work, but looking back now, the wonder to me is that any of us are alive to tell the tale. They were not hoops, they were demons. First, they would not fit in their sockets at all, and we had to jump on them and kick them and hammer them at the boatwood hook. And when they were in, it turned out they were the wrong hoops for those particular sockets and had to come out again. But they would not come out until 2 of us had gone and struggled with them for 5 minutes, when we would jump up suddenly and then they would throw us in the river and try to drown us. They had hinges in the middle, and when we were not looking, they nipped us in the hinges, the delicate parts of the body. But they would not come out until 2 of us had gone and struggled with them for 5 minutes, when they would jump up suddenly and try to throw us in the water and drown us. They had hinges in the middle, and when we were not looking, they nipped us with these hinges in delicate parts of the body. And whilst we were resting with one side of the hoop and endeavouring to persuade it to do its duty, the other side would come behind us in a cowardly manner and hit us over the head. We got them fixed at last, and all that was to be done was to arrange the covering over them. George unrolled it and fastened one end over the noose of the boat. Harris stood in the middle to take it from George and roll it onto me, and I kept by the stern to receive it. It was a long time coming down to me. George did his part all right, but it was new work to Harris, and he bungled it. How he managed it, I do not know. He could not explain himself, but by some mysterious process or other he succeeded, after 10 minutes of superhuman effort, in getting himself completely rolled up in it. He was so firmly wrapped round and tucked in and folded over that he could not get out. He, of course, made frantic struggles for freedom, the birthright of every Englishman, and in doing so, I learned this afterwards, knocked over George, and then George, swearing at Harris, began to struggle too, and he got himself entangled and rolled up. I knew nothing about this at the time. I did not understand the business at all myself. I had been told to stand where I was and wait till the canvas came to me, and Montmorency and I stood there, waiting, both good as gold. We could see the canvas being violently jerked and tossed about, pretty considerably in fact, but we supposed this was part of the method and did not interfere. We also heard much smothered language coming from underneath it, and we guessed that they were finding the job rather troublesome, and concluded that we would wait until things had got a little simpler before we joined in. We waited some time, but matters seemed to only get more and more involved, until at last George's head came wriggling over the boat and spoke up. It said, "Give us a hand, can't you, Coco? Standing there all stuffed, mummy. When were you going to see we're both suffocating, you dummy?" I could never withstand an appeal for help, so I went and undid them. Not before it was time either, for Harris was nearly black in the face. It took us half an hour's hard labour after that, before it was properly up, and then we cleared the decks and got out supper. We put the kettle on to boil, up in the nose of the boat, and went down to the stern, and pretended to take no notice of it, but set to work to get other things out. That is the only way to get a kettle to boil up the river. If it sees you're waiting for it and getting anxious, it will never sing to you. You have to go away and begin your meal as if you are not going to have any tea at all. You must not even look round at it. Then you'll hear it spluttering away, mad to be made into some tea. It is a good plan, too, if you're in a great hurry, to talk very loudly to each other about how you don't need any tea and are not going to have any. You get near the kettle so as it can overhear you, and then you shout, "I don't want any tea, do you, George?" To which George shouts back, "Oh no, I don't like tea. We'll have lemonade instead. Tea's so indigestible." Upon which the kettle boils over and puts the stove out. We adopted this harmless bit of trickery, and the result was that by the time everything else was ready, the tea was waiting. Then we lit the lantern and squatted down to supper. We wanted that supper. For 35 minutes, not a sound was heard throughout the length and breadth of the boat, save the clank of cutlery and crockery, and the steady grinding of 4 sets of molars. At the end of 35 minutes, Harris said, "Ah," and took his left leg out from under him and put his right one in there instead. 5 minutes afterwards, George said, "Ah," too, and threw his plate out on the bank. And 3 minutes later than that, Montmorency gave a sign of first contentment that he had exhibited since we started, rolled over on his side and spread his leg out. And then at last I said, "Ah," and bent my head back and bumped it against one of the hoops. I didn't mind it. I didn't even swear. How good one feels when one is full, how satisfied with ourselves and with the world. People who have tried it tell me that a clear conscience makes you very happy and contented, but a full stomach does the business quite as well, and is cheaper and more easily obtained. One feels so forgiving and generous after a substantial and well-digested meal, so noble-minded, so kind-hearted. It is very strange, this domination of our intellect by our digestive organs. We cannot work, we cannot think, unless our stomach wills it so. It dictates our emotions, our passions. After eggs and bacon, it says work. After beefsteak and porter, it says sleep. After a cup of tea, 2 spoonfuls in each cup, and don't let it stand for more than 3 minutes, it says to the brain, now rise and show your strength, be eloquent and deep and tender, see with a clear eye into nature and into life. Spread your white wings of quivering thought and soar, a godlike spirit, over the whirling world beneath you. up through long lanes of faming stars of the gates of eternity. After hot muffins, it says, be dull and soulless, like the beast of the field, a brainless animal with listless eye, unlit by a ray of fancy, or hope, or fear, or love, or life. And after brandy, taken in sufficient quantity, it says, now, come, fool, grin, tumble, for your fellow men may laugh, drivel in folly and splutter in senseless sound, and show what a helpless ninny is a poor man whose wit and will are drowned, like kittens, side by side in half an inch of alcohol. We are but the veriest, sorriest slaves of our stomach. Reach not after morality and righteousness, my friends. Watch vigilantly your stomach, and diet it with care and judgment. Then virtue and contentment will come and reign within your heart, unsought by any effort of your own, and you will be a good citizen, a loving husband, and a tender father, a noble and pious man. For our supper, George and Harris and I were quarrelsome and snappy and ill-tempered. After our supper, we sat and beamed at one another, and we beamed upon the dog too. We loved each other, and we loved everybody. Harris, in moving about, trod on George's corn. Had this happened before supper, George would have expressed wishes and desires concerning Harris's fate in this world and the next, which would have made a thoughtful man shudder. As it was, he said, steady, old man, where we eat? And Harris, instead of merely observing, in his most unpleasant tones, that a fellow could hardly help treading on some bit of George's foot, if he had to move about within 10 yards of where George was sitting, suggesting that George never ought to come into an ordinary-sized boat with feet that length, and advising him to hang over the side, as he would have done before supper, now said, oh, I'm sorry, old chap, I hope I haven't hurt you. And George said, not at all, and it was his fault, and Harris said no, it was his. It was quite pretty to hear them. We lit our pipes and sat looking out in the quiet night and talked. George said, why could we not always be like this, away from the world with its sins and temptation, leading sober, peaceful lives and doing good? I said it was the sort of thing I'd often longed for myself, and we discussed the possibility of our going away, we four, to some handy, well-fitted desert island, and living there in the woods. Harris said that the danger about desert islands, as far as he's heard, is that they were so damp. But George said no, not if properly drained. And then we got on to drains, and that brought George in mind of a very funny thing that happened to his father once. He said his father was travelling with another fellow through Wales, and one night they stopped at a little inn where there were some other fellows, and they joined other fellows and spent the evening with them. They had a very jolly evening and sat up late, and by the time they came to bed, they, and this is when George's father was a very young man, were slightly jolly too. They, George's father and George's father's friend, were asleep in the same room, but in different beds. They took the candle and went up. The candle lurched against the wall when they got into the room and went out, and they had to undress and grope into bed in the dark. This they did, but instead of getting into separate beds as they thought they were doing, they climbed into the same one without knowing it, one getting in with his head at the top, and the other crawling in from the opposite side of the compass and lying with his feet on the pillow. There was silence for a moment, and George's father said, "Joe?" "What's the matter, Tom?" replied Joe's voice from the other end of the bed. "Why, man, there's a man in my bed," said George's father. "His feet are on my pillow." "Well, that's an extraordinary thing, Tom," answered the other. "I'm blessed if there isn't a man in my bed too." "What are we going to do?" asked George's father. "Well, I'm going to chuck him out," replied Joe. "So am I," said George's father valiantly. There was a brief struggle, followed by 2 heavy bumps on the floor, and a rather doleful voice said, "I say, Tom." "Yes." "How have you got on?" "Well, tell you the truth, my man's chucked me out." "So's mine. I'd say I don't think much of this inn, do you?" "What was the name of that inn?" said Harris. "The Pig and Whistle," said George. "Why?" "Ah, no, it isn't the same," replied Harris. "What do you mean?" queried George. "Why, it's so curious," murmured Harris. "But precisely that very same thing happened to my father once in a country inn. I've often heard him tell the tale. I thought it might have been the same inn." We turned in at 10 that night, and I thought I should sleep well being tired, but I didn't. As a rule, I undress and put my head on the pillow, and then somebody bangs at the door and says it's 8:30. But tonight, everything seemed against me. The novelty of it all, the hardness of the boat, the cramped position. I was lying with my feet under one seat and my head on another. The sound of the lapping water round the boat, and the wind among the branches keeping me restless and disturbed. I did get to sleep for a few hours, and then some part of the boat seemed to have grown up in the night, for it certainly was not there when we started, and it had been disappeared by morning, kept digging me in the spine. I slept through it for a while, dreaming that I had swallowed a sovereign, and that were cutting a hole in my back with a gimlet, so as to try and get it out. I thought it very unkind of them, and I told them that I would owe them the money, and they should have it in the end of the month. But they would not hear of it, and said it would be much better if they had it, because otherwise the interest would accumulate so. I got quite cross with them after a bit, and told them what I thought of them, and then they gave the gimlet such an excruciating wrench that I woke up. The boat seemed stuffy, and my head ached, so I thought I would step out into the cool night air. I slipped on what clothes I could find about, some of my own, some of George's and Harris's, and crept under the canvas onto the bank. It was a glorious night, and the moon had sunk and left the quiet earth alone with the stars. It seemed as if in the silence and the hush, whilst her children were sleeping, they were talking with her, their sister, conversing of mighty mysteries in voices too vast and deep for childish human ears to catch the sound. They awe us, these strange stars, so cold, so clear. We are as children whose small feet have strayed into some dim-lit temple of the god they've been taught to worship but not know, and standing where the echoing dome spans the long vistas of the shadowy night, glance up, half hoping, half afraid to see some awful vision hovering there. And yet it seems so full of comfort and strength, the night. In its great presence our small sorrows creep away ashamed. The day had been so full of fret and care, and our hearts have been so full of evil and bitter thoughts, and the world has seemed so hard and wrong to us. Then night, like some great loving mother, gently lays her hand upon our fevered head and turns our little tear-stained face up to hers and smiles. And though she does not speak, we know she would say, and lay our hot flushed cheeks against our bosom, and the pain is gone. Sometimes our pain is very real and deep, and we stand before her very silent, because there is no language for our pain, only a moan. The night's heart is full of pity for us. She cannot ease our aching. She takes our hand in hers, and the little world grows very small and far away beneath us, and borne on her dark wings, we pass for a moment into a mightier presence than her own, and in the wondrous light of that great presence, all human life lies like a book before us, and we know that pain and sorrow are but the angels of God. Only for those who have worn the crown of suffering can look upon this wondrous light, and they, when they return, may not speak of it, or tell the mystery they know. Once upon a time, through a strange country, there rode some goodly knights, and their path lay by a deep wood, where tangled briars grew thick and strong, and tore the flesh of them that lost their way within. And the leaves of the trees that grew in the wood were very dark and thick, so that no ray of light came through the branches to lighten the gloom and the sadness. And as they passed that dark wood, one knight of those that rode, missing his comrades, wandered far away, and returned to them no more. And they, sorely grieving, rode on without him, mourning him as one dead. And now, when they reached the fair castle towards which they had been journeying, they stayed there many days and made merry. And one night, as they sat in cheerful ease around the logs that burned in the great hall, and drank a loving measure, there came a comrade that they had lost, and greeted them. His clothes were ragged like a beggar's, and many sad wounds were on his sweet flesh, but his face shone with a great radiance of deep joy. And they questioned him, asking him what had befallen him. And he told them how, in the dark wood, he had lost his way, and had wandered many days and nights, till torn and bleeding he had lain down to die. Then, when he was nigh until death, lo, through the savage gloom there came to him a stately maiden, and took him by the hand, and led him through devious paths unknown to any man, until upon the darkness of the wood there dawned a light, such as the light of day was, but a little lamp unto the sun. And in that wondrous light our way-worn knight saw, as in a dream, a vision, and so glorious, so fair the vision seemed, that of his bleeding wounds he thought no more, but stood as one entranced, whose joy is as deep as the sea, and whereof no man can tell the depth. And the vision faded, and the knight, kneeling upon the ground, thanked the good saint who into that sad wood had strayed his steps, so he had seen the vision that lay there hid. And the name of the dark forest was Sorrow, but of the vision that the good knight saw therein we may not speak or tell. End of chapter 10.